Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. In the last episode, we discussed SQLite database. Like many other databases, it requires knowledge of the SQL. It happens that there are other ways to operate on such database without SQL. SQL Alchemy is a Python library which allows us to operate on the database on the higher level. We define the Python class, and next, thanks to SQL Alchemy, we can easily translate that Python class into the table in our database and later, without any SQL, perform different operations. This technique is called object relation mapping, and it's widely used in web development frameworks like Django or Flask. It's not mandatory to program or analyze data, but it's worth to knowing that such option exists, and it's actually pretty handy. Let's take a look on how it works. All information about the SQL Alchemy we can find on the SQL.org. We will jump straight to the coding, and we are going to write very simple program which at the beginning creates a database at the table and then add the data to the database and reads the data from the database with the SQL Alchemy. First things first, we need to make sure that we have the SQL Alchemy installed. Pip install SQL Alchemy. We should have it already on our PC, so we can move to the programming. So this is the first program which we are going to create the database. At the beginning, we import different elements from the SQL Alchemy, and I need to say that I never remember what to import. I always copy and paste this part of the code from previous programs. So we copy a few elements, and then we create our database. Create engine. Here is the name of the database, and here is the information that we want to create SQLite database. Then we define object base, which we'll use to map the classes with the tables. So, as we said at the beginning, the SQL Alchemy allows us to translate the classes, Python classes, into the tables, and here comes the whole trick. We define the class transactions, which is based on the object base. The name of the table we want to create is a transaction, so it's the same as our class, just for the simplicity. And here is the list of the columns we want to see in our table. So we want to see the transaction ID, date, item ID, and the price. So it's basically the table of the transactions where we are selling the different items. And each of these columns is based on the object column imported at the beginning from SQL Alchemy, where the first parameter is the type of the column we want to see. And in case of the primary key, we also need to say that this column is our primary key, like in our case, the transactions ID. Then we have the constructor, which is not mandatory, but it's pretty handy as we are going to see it later on. And we create tables in the database. So summarizing, we are connecting with this database. If the database does not exist, it should be created. Then we want to create a table which is going to be a reflection of that class with 4 columns. So before doing that, let's take a look in our folder. And as we can see, we have no database for the time being. Let's run our program and let's see if the database has been created and what's inside. So we again double click, and with the DB viewer for SQLite, we can see that one table called transaction has been created with the 4 columns, so exactly as our class. We have 4 columns with different types, and that's precisely what we see inside of the database, those 4 columns. For the time being, we don't have any data in that table, but that's what we are going to address in the next part. Okay, so let's go to the second file, 2_Python. And at the beginning, we import the previous file. So we import db, this is db.py, so we want to import that class, and we definitely want to import our class transactions. We are going to use it. So we import that. Then we need to import something which is called session maker. This will allows us to add the data to our database. And we also want to import the library random. We are going to randomly generate 10 transactions, which we are going to add to our database. We are creating the session maker object called session, and now we are generating our transactions. The randomly selected item ID from the range of 0 to 1000 and the price between 20 to 50. Then, and this is the most interesting part, we are creating the new object based on the class transaction. So we are using the class defined in that file. We are creating the new object, and we are using the constructor to pass the information about the transaction ID. T stands for the transaction ID, the date, in our case it's a fixed date actually, but then randomly selected item ID and the randomly selected price. And the next, we are adding that object to our session. And this is the whole procedure to add data to our table in our database. So this object represents one row in the table. At the end, we commit all the changes. So if we run that program, what we are going to see, what we should see 10 rows in the table transactions. Let's check it. Let's run our program. And let's go to the database. And straight to browser data. And this is what we actually see. 10 transactions generated by our program. Let's go to the final stage of our simple program, which is free underscore query, where in the very similar fashion, like in the insert, we are going to connect with our database. We import DB, we create the session. Just this time we are using the session not to add the objects, but to query this table to get all data from the table. And here we are printing this out. This is going to show us all the data, and to be more precise, all the transactions, all the prices. Then we want to select the transactions with price over 40, so the query will look a little bit different. We again use the object session query, and here we are having the table transactions, but we filter our transactions to select only the one with the prices over 40, and we print it. So let's run our program this time, and we should see the results of two queries. At the beginning, we see all the 10 transactions and the price, and later on the transactions only with the price over 40, which in our case are 4 transactions, 11, 12, 14, 18 with the price over 40, without using any SQL. Everything here is based on the object defined at the beginning, the transactions. At the beginning, we use that object to create the table, but later on, we use that object to add data to our table, and later on, to query the data from our table. So this was purely theoretical, very simple example. In the next episode, we are going to see again very simple mini project where we are going to get the price of the Bitcoin, and we are going to save it into SQLite database with the use of the SQL Alchemy. That's it for today. Thank you for your attention, and see you soon.